Testing. 1, 2, 3. Alrighty, chat. Okay. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Boston, Massachusetts. Just a reminder that everything we discuss on stream today is intended to be for educational purposes only, and nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. Goes very true for today. So, if you guys have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. No. Yes. Zoom camera. Okay. I saw a post on our subreddit the other day about someone being frustrated about, every time I sort of toss out that disclaimer, I don't talk about how hard it is to actually get medical treatment, and I don't talk about how expensive it is. It's very true. I don't address those things. And at the same time, it's difficult to, right? Because the cost of treatment depends on where you're from. And just a couple of things to mention to y'all if y'all are struggling to find a therapist or something like that. A lot of the resources are, dependent on what part of the world you're in. But a couple things to consider. One is that there's this place called the Open Path Collective, which is a group of therapists who have committed to providing therapy like at a cheap cost. So if you join the Open Path Collective, you allot a certain number of hours per week that you'll charge like $20 for. Audio delay. Testing 1, 2, 3. Do we have a... I don't see the delay. It's lagging for like 0.5 seconds. Okay. I got rickrolled, so be it. It won't be the last time, chat. All right, so let's continue then, if it's good. So Open Path Collective is good. RAD is good. Rise Above the Disorder. So they're, they're more geared towards gamers, and they provide grants for people to receive therapy, so they're fantastic. And the other thing that you can always do is contact actual therapists or community mental health centers and just tell people that you're not in a place to be able to afford much for therapy. And oftentimes, people will make exceptions for the right kind of situation. So, it sort of depends on where you are and what your circumstances are. But generally speaking, my experience has been that most therapists really are in it to help people. As well as to earn a living. And so sometimes they'll just say, okay, I know I certainly have, I think oddly enough, sometimes the more expensive therapists are more likely to take free clients, because if they charge more, they can sort of afford to take the financial hit. Whereas if you're charging, let's say $75 per appointment, it can be harder to see a free client than if you're charging $300 per appointment. So just ask around. And it is really unfortunate that it's hard to access therapy in many parts of the world. So when are we talking about the On Fire community? Right now. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, so we made a post, there's a sequence of events, which we'll go into, probably not today, but so I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we've been discussing around gender dynamics in this community. And so the sequence of events is this. Someone made a post about there's a misogyny problem in this community. And then we sort of talked about that. I made a post about addressing misogyny. And then many people made posts criticizing what I said, which I think is fantastic. So let me be the first to say that, so a couple things. One is that I'm not an expert on gender dynamics, right? So if I speak in that realm, I'm unlike neuroscience or spirituality or clinical medicine. I'm not nearly as qualified or confident in what I say. So it's totally fine to be critical of Dr. K. I've been reading basically every single post and most of the replies, and I think there's actually a lot of good stuff in there. The other thing that I want to say is that this is a real problem in the world, and I feel really, really grateful that our community is available to talk about this. So I'm trying to figure out how to put this into words. So I think we're going to try to fix this problem. And I think that if we want to try to fix this problem, it can't just be Dr. K. It has to be all of us kind of working together, and fixing the problem is only going to work if people are critical of it and we work through those criticisms to arrive at some kind of consensus. Right. So I have no problem with people offering constructive criticism that for the most part has been incredibly respectful. So, and I think it just speaks to the weight of the problem that we experience. And I can also see why it's been such a hard problem to fix, because it is a complex issue and that people tend to reduce it to simplicities. So we're working on it. I also want to give a huge shout out to our mods who have been, this is, I don't know if y'all have been to other corners of the internet, but I'm incredibly proud of our mods in our community for keeping the discussion as civil as possible. The internet is quickly devolving into echo chambers and degenerate areas where people really don't offer contrary opinions. And I think that's part of the reason that the problem has grown to the proportion it has. It's because people are not willing to engage in dialogue. So huge shout out to the mods for handling this situation incredibly well. Like I said, I'm reading most of it, and I think there's a lot of good stuff from both sides. And I think that's actually part of the problem, is that somewhere along the way, this became about two different sides that oppose each other. We're working on it. And I think our responses may be a little bit surprising. So they may be a little bit different from how most people handle this situation. So we're still trying to figure out, what exactly to do about this. But I think we've got a couple of really cool ideas that I'd love to, we're going to continue working on it. So if y'all have been unhappy with stuff that I've said, that's totally fine. If you've been critical of stuff that I've said, if you've been happy with stuff that I've said, all that stuff is fantastic. What I really want to ask our community to do is to, stick around and stay engaged and share your perspective, and try to listen to other people's. Because I think ultimately, that's how we're going to fix this problem. Is not by rage quitting when someone says something that we're disappointed in. It's sharing with the other person that, hey, I'm really disappointed in what you said, and here's why. And then effective dialogue is basically the one thing that has been missing in gender dynamics, right? It's two sides and there's no dialogue. It's not really dialogue. It's just talking points, yelling at each other, and the straw manning of arguments, which is exactly why it's still a problem, because no one is actually attempting to communicate and understand someone else's perspective. It's just anytime we talk about someone having it hard, there's a one-upping issue that starts to happen where there's just not enough support to go around to where everyone is starving for it. And I don't think that that's it's not anyone's fault that you're starving for validation or support, or you feel alone, right? It's kind of interesting, but if you think about, what kind of kids fight over candy, it's the kids that never have enough. And so I think what we're seeing society-wide is that people are going through very, very difficult experiences and people are not able to support them. And so it's support has become a scarce resource. And something about what's going on is a consequence of that. Yeah, someone's saying not always. Fair enough. Ditech 2 is asking, Dr. K, are you going to talk about the relationship between alcohol addiction and major depression one day? Haven't we already done that? I feel like we've got one. Oh, no, never mind. Never mind. Alcohol addiction, major depression. Sure, we'll talk about that one day. So a couple of other things. So for those of you that are interested in speaking of, depression and alcohol usage, so based on popular demand, we have implemented a gifting function to Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. So if y'all are interested in sending it to someone for the holidays, I know it's kind of a weird thing to send to people for the holidays. Hey, bro, you've got anxiety. Here, watch this guide by this dude that I watch on the internet. You guys are welcome to get that. I think the other interesting thing is that a lot of parents have been getting it for their kids, which is a good resource for kids, I suppose. Also goes back to the fact that half of our audience is over the age of 34. But I know it's kind of interesting. And I think you guys can use !guide for more information. There we go. So y'all can gift it if you want to, because we made it. And then so there were two features that people were requesting at a very high volume. One is the ability to search the meditations by like certain criteria. So we now have an indexed searchable meditation thing in the guide. So we built that. And the second thing was like the ability to gift it to other people. So they watched it and they were like, oh, we really want to give this to so-and-so. And I was like, okay. So our dev team has made that. Okay. All right. So yeah, our community is lots of 30 gangs, 21 gangs, like whatever. It's not, we're not here to discriminate. Okay. So couple things what we're going to do today. Oh my God, John. All right. So today's going to be tricky. So we're going to try to talk about a couple of different things. The highest on the list is talking a little bit about the anti-work movement and talking a little bit about the psychology of like what's going on with people and their employers. So big disclaimer here. This is going to be like, once again, just Dr. K thinking about stuff. So it's not something that I've done, an extensive amount of literature reviews on. It's not something I'm an expert in. I'm just going to share with y'all my thoughts about what's going on right now and how we got to this point, and offer a psychological perspective with a few key takeaways about like why we ended up here. Second thing that I'm going to do is talk about maladaptive daydreaming. So we've gotten tons and tons of posts and requests about maladaptive daydreaming. So I've been doing my homework over some amount of time, and I think we're going to offer sort of a more in-depth lecture in terms of understanding maladaptive daydreaming. And then we've got a couple of subreddit posts if we, get past those two. Okay. Everyone's like F capitalism. Yeah. So that's where I don't think it's quite that simple, but let's get into it. Okay. So why are so many Americans quitting their jobs? I don't know if this is an America thing, by the way. If it is, sorry, Europeans and other East Asians, Southeast Asians, other people, South Americans. I don't know that we have a huge, following in Africa, but people outside of America, let's say. So there are a bunch of people who are quitting their jobs, and the anti-work subreddit is one of the fastest growing subreddits right here. Okay. On Reddit. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why so many people seem to be quitting their jobs and kind of what's going on there. So to try to understand from when I say scientific perspective, I mean sort of like a theoretical scientific perspective. What can we understand from things like the theory of evolution? What can we understand about large-scale psychological trends? And what can we understand about psychology that propagates this kind of thing that makes it actually worse? And so we're just going to sort of comment on it. It's going to be kind of like just Dr. K's thoughts about this thing. Okay. So the first thing that I want to say is that, like I mentioned earlier, this is not something that I'm an expert in. It's not something that I'm going to be citing sources or things like that, citing literature. It's just sort of like my take on why people are quitting so much. Okay. So the first thing is that there seems to be an unprecedented amount of people quitting their jobs and doing so in a spectacular and social media karma farming sort of way, right? So people will post onto anti-work about, oh, like my boss told me to like come in on Saturday and canceled my vacation and canceled Christmas. So I said, screw you, and I quit. And so they posted it on the internet. It gets a bunch of karma, and then people post about it again and again and again and again. And so what I thought I'd talk a little bit about like why this is happening now, like what forces led up to this, and sort of understanding the psychology behind it. So the first is that I think that the internet has become one of the great equalizers. So generally speaking, what causes things to change are when there are major human creations that will tend to level the playing field between like unequal groups of people. And generally speaking, I think the internet is like the third biggest thing that has been discovered. So the two that I'd say come before this, so the first is the printing press, right? So when reading and information became more widely available, we started to see a drastic change within society. The second big thing that seemed to equalize a lot of stuff was the invention of gunpowder. So if you look at things like the American Revolution and like feudal societies, in the past, what it used to be that if you were stronger and had a sword, like you could kill other people. And so there was like a big disparity in terms of power and like physical strength. Over time, what seemed to happen is with the invention of like gunpowder and the pistol, you have people that are able to exert a lot more power against like people who were traditionally more powerful. So you have things like the American Revolution and stuff like that. But I think guns have been another huge equalizer. And I think the third great equalizer, and there may be many more before this, I'm not a historian, but I'd say that the internet is a huge equalizer. And people have, I think, not really understood the impact of what the dissemination of information has truly had on our society. So 50 years ago, if you lived in a small town and you had some crappy job, like that was it, right? Like you looked around at your options and you were not aware of like what your other options were. You were vaguely aware that other jobs existed elsewhere, but your ability to compare yourself to other people and to understand what else was out there was like quite narrow. And we talk about some of the evils of social media and information dissemination, FOMO, and things like that on this channel. We talk about overly comparing and the weaknesses of overly comparing. We talk about social media and the dangers of social media in terms of making people feel like they're left out and things like that. But I think one of the things that it's important to remember is that social media, just like video games, are tools, and that tools can be used for good or for ill. And so one of the things that started to happen with the advent of the internet is people have started to realize that there's like better things out there, right? So there's like a greater awareness in general that the world doesn't have to be as crappy as your situation is. And I think this acknowledgement that there are better options out there has been absolutely devastating for certain employers. So this is also where I'm going to kind of jump ahead here for a second, but if we look at why things have gotten so bad, I would say, in short, employers have had no negative selection pressure against poor practices. So if I own, let's say, a major cereal manufacturing company and people are unhappy, I haven't really had any need to make my employees happy, right? I've been able to say, because there hasn't been a selection pressure or consequence, you guys can go screw yourselves, right? So I've been able to say that thus far. And so we've had things like the creation of unions, which have been designed to balance corporate power, and all that stuff is fantastic. I'm not going to go down that road. But I think there's another huge balancing issue here, which is like the internet, because now we're beginning to see huge movements towards equality. So you see these things like the Arab Spring. You see these things where people are now aware that other options exist, right? So the first thing that's happened is that the internet has sort of started to equalize the playing field in terms of removing ignorance. And so this is another thing that corporations have benefited a lot from, which is like, preying essentially on ignorance. So like if my workers don't know what else is out there, I can give them crappy things. So in general, like I think, for example, the quality of food has thankfully in restaurants, like generally speaking, improved over the course of my life. And why is that? It's because now I have so much access to information about where I can get food and where there's good food and where there's bad food. As a result, there were a lot of crappy restaurants that, existed when I grew up that like I didn't realize that I could drive 10 minutes away further and like find a really good restaurant. That was amazing. It was all like word of mouth. But with the advent of internet sharing information, I've been able to find good restaurants. As we sort of discover there are better restaurants and worse restaurants, like better companies and worse companies, people have started gravitating towards the better companies and moving away from the worse companies. So I think a lot of corporations have continued to exist very profitably, basically preying on the ignorance of their employees and their employees not realizing what else is out there. So there are a couple of other things that have happened recently, and I think the biggest one is COVID. So I think COVID has been a great example of the blindfold coming off. So for a long time, companies have sort of assumed or believed or taught their employees to believe that particular things were true. The first is that you have to be at the office to work, right? And so what companies would do is like there was so much crap that people had to put up with, like commuting is the top of the list, right? Where like you had to commute, like a commute was a given. And so when looking at a job, I even remember when I got my first place in Boston, or not just first place, every single place I had in Boston, one of the main considerations I had when I was like renting an apartment was, what does my commute look like? What does the commute look like? What does the commute look like? What does the commute look like? Because people were spending half an hour or up to an hour, I mean, depending on where you live and what your situation is, or 5 minutes if you're super lucky. You know, people would spend anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours of their life per day commuting to and from work. And so what's happened with COVID is we sort of started to realize, oh, you actually don't need to commute to work. Like, you don't actually have to be in the office. And this was a huge like revelation for a lot of people, right? So the other thing that corporations tended to take advantage of was almost like geographical predation, where like, you know, in the past, your job options were restricted by your geography. So if I live in like Beaumont, Texas, or if I live in like some small town in Alabama, or, you know, if I live in some small town in India, my only options for work were like what was like available around me. And so with the advent of the internet, and especially with COVID and work from home, you're no longer geographically restricted. So there used to be some companies that, like, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of a company town, where there's like one major employer and most of the people work for that employer, and people don't have a lot of choice. They don't have a lot of ability to like laterally move or go to other companies. And with the advent of COVID and everything moving online, suddenly now corporations are no longer able to engage in like essentially geographical predation, right? So like now, if I don't like the job that I have in you know, Mobile, Alabama, I can go and apply for a job in Canada, right? So I can actually like work in a different country. I can work in a different part of the state. This is something that corporations have loved doing for a long time until it starts to hurt them, which is like when there was all this concern about, you know, shipping jobs overseas or outsourcing to places like India and China. And companies have been thrilled to do that thus far. We've like moved manufacturing over to China. We've moved manufacturing over to India, and people have lost their jobs here. And like corporations have been like, great, like I can move elsewhere. I don't actually have to employ the people here. And now what's happening is the reverse, right? So where employees are starting to realize, I actually don't have to work for this crap job with you. I can actually work remotely at this place that's somewhere else. And so like this has been a huge thing that COVID has sort of unveiled, and I think companies are now reeling from it. Next thing that COVID has revealed to people is what they need to survive. So there used to be a huge like idea about what was required for like survival, success, and happiness in life, right? This is the idea of the grind. People are like grinding left and right, and it's like, I'm going to grind, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to become successful, I'm going to make more money, and then I can retire at the age of 65. I'm going to commute 2 hours of my life every day to work 9 hours a day. So it's going to be an 11-hour commitment per day. I'm going to sleep for 8 hours, which gives me like 2 hours a day of recreation or whatever. I'm going to do this for about 40 years, then I'm going to retire, and I'm going to buy a condo somewhere where it's warm and where there's a beach, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of my life. And this was accepted. This was just sort of like what, you know, people used to be okay with. And there's sort of this like idea that, you know, the harder you work, the more successful you're going to be. And then essentially what the corporations did is took all the hardworking people and like predated them to extinction. And so they essentially like, you know, there's this idea that you have to grind really hard and then you'll be happy at the end. And what tends to happen instead, like during COVID, is people started to realize like, what is the value of money? What is the value of my time? What do I actually need to survive? And what I think what people really discovered is that they don't need money nearly as much as they thought they did. And that an extra $5,000 a year or $10,000 a year is not worth an extra 15 hours a week. And so as COVID has taken the blindfold off, a lot of people have started to re-question their priorities and what they're willing to sacrifice. So just kind of stepping into evolutionary theory for a second. So I think that basically like COVID has put a selection pressure on jobs, right? So this is where like before, these behaviors and practices by companies went on unchecked because there was no consequence in the environment. So, you know, the theory of evolution says survival of the fittest. And since companies were able to get away with that sort of thing, they did get away with it because there was no consequence for them. And now what I think corporations are really discovering is that there is actually a selection pressure, which is what's happening, right? So workers en masse are deciding to select for a particular kind of job and select against another kind of job. And this is where a lot of people are starting to get really upset, and they're saying there's a labor shortage. There is not a labor shortage. There is a wage shortage, right? The labor is there. It's just it doesn't want to work your crappy job, which you've been able to propagate for a long time and haven't had to keep up to snuff because like there's been no selection pressure against it, right? So these companies have become like bloated, profit driven. And I'm not like a leftist, by the way. Just, I'm just saying that if there's no like selection pressure against something, it's going to become bloated and like overblown and like, the wealth inequality is increasing and people are just not going to put up with it anymore. And so what we're sort of seeing, there's some really sort of simple evidence. I'm going to draw a very big correlation here. But that basically, if you want to like play a game with someone, you have to let them win at least 30% of the time. So if you look at like play behavior amongst animals, and even if you think about like your kids, for example, like you've got to let them win some of the time, right? It's like a 30-70 swing. If they lose more than 70% of the time, they're going to stop playing. If they win 70% of the time, they're going to significantly more than 70% of the time, they're going to stop playing. So if you even think about the way that video games are designed, video games are not designed to be like 100% victory all the time, right? They sort of are, but they give you like false starts. You have to wipe on a boss multiple times before you down it. And so what's been happening for far too long is that like companies have been racking up W's without taking L's. And now like their karmic seed is coming to fruition where people just aren't willing to put up with it anymore. And so like now what's happening is they've created these systems that have become essentially bloated and vulnerable to this kind of like essentially like workers hitting back, right? And I know this is starting to sound like the Communist Manifesto, but I mean, it's really more about psychology and evolutionary theory. I'm not suggesting one is good or one is bad. It's just, this is what's happened. There have been too many unchecked corporate excesses and like people are just tired of it now. So there's another huge thing that's starting to change a little bit, which I think I've worked with a lot of startups. I've worked with a lot of CEOs. I've worked with a lot of investment banks, and I've started to see some interesting changes in those places. So the first example that I'll give y'all is that working at an investment bank like Goldman Sachs or like JP Morgan or whatever used to be a very coveted job. And now what tends to happen is people want to do their 2 years at a place like Goldman and they want a GTFO as quickly as possible. So this is kind of interesting because this is not just something that's happening at the bottom tier of like wage, right? This is even happening very high up. You see this a lot in medicine. You see it a lot in residency where people are starting to like, decide like, I'm not going to become a doctor if I can become a nurse practitioner because I can make way more, sure, I'll make less money, but the amount of time that I have to sacrifice to become a doctor is no longer worth it. So I'm going to go the NP route. So we're seeing this at so many different levels of work. I absolutely see it in investment banking, where I had a very prominent client who was struggling with turnover. And so, what they sort of had this attitude that it's like, you work hard and like you invest, you pay your dues. And then once you rise to the top, that's when you get to relax. And they sort of didn't understand that like people are just not having that anymore, right? Like they're not willing to, work their asses off for 20 years so that they can start flying first class at the age of 46. People are just not willing to make that trade. So in investment banking, what you're seeing is a massive exodus from banking to easier fields. So people will go be CFO, they'll go join VC, they'll go join private equity. Things aren't really that much better in those fields as well, but they tend to be better. So what we're seeing even at higher levels of education is like, much more turnover and like selection pressures away from money. So another good example of this is like I've worked with a lot of people who are engineers at Google. And they actually really love Google. So Google's a good example of someone who seems to be doing this right. So Google in some ways actually may pay less than what someone is able to make somewhere else. But basically every person I've ever worked with at Google loves working there. And why do they love working there, even though they may get paid $5,000 less? It's because Google like sort of takes care of them. So they have a cafeteria that's open for like 18 hours a day. You can come in and work when you want to, where you want to. You don't have to come into the office if you don't want to. You can work from like 10 p.m. to like 6 a.m. So I've had people who work at Google who like will basically try to show up there for dinner before the cafeteria closes because the food is good. They work all night. Google keeps them supplied with like energy drinks or whatever other unhealthy crap they want. And then they have breakfast in the morning. They go home, they game for a few hours, and they pass out. Right? So like some employers are recognizing what people actually want and some employers aren't. And the employers that are starting to recognize that, oh, like turnover, turnover is happening because people don't like working here, and throwing money at the problem, which many of them are not even doing. Throwing money at the problem is not actually a perfect solution. So what we're starting to see, I'm seeing this a lot more in terms of like startups and like young people that I advise and people that I work with, is that even people who are in finance, like they don't want to just like be doing gigantic mergers and acquisitions for gigantic piles of money that the partner at their firm sees, which they see a tiny little slice of. They want to start doing work that is meaningful and impactful, and like they can actually be proud of what they do. And so the pressures on businesses are changing, and businesses aren't keeping up. So this is the third thing that I'm going to talk about. And here's the real psychological mistake that most employers are making. So I'm going to ask y'all a question. So when there's a kid who acts out and has behavioral problems in school, and you punish the kid and you tell him, hey, you're a bad kid, what happens to that kid? Does the kid act out worse, or do they get better when you punish them and you say, you're a dumb kid, you're a stupid kid, you're a bad behaved kid? It gets worse. So what do you think is happening when corporations are saying, oh, these workers, like kids nowadays, are so lazy? They're so lazy. There's a labor shortage. People just don't want to work. They just want to get their federal handout. They want to sit at home because they're lazy. They're lazy. They're so lazy. Oh my goodness. And this is their karmic seed coming to fruition, right? This is their chicken coming to hatch, or rooster coming to hatch, or whatever. Right? So this is where the biggest mistake that corporations have made is that they have grossly invalidated the experience of their workers. So I'll give you guys a prime example of this, and that is the field of PR. So when a company has a problem, right? So let's say like let's just say hypothetically that you're a game developer who has, some kind of DOJ or Department of Labor investigation against you for systemic sexual discrimination. What do? You hire a PR firm, right? So somewhere along the way, companies started resorting to PR to fix their problems, which is like a fundamental mistake, right? Because it's like you're not actually fixing the problem, you're just fixing the perception of the problem. And this is a huge problem because at some point, companies stopped actually like listening to their employees and what they want and what is hard for them. And instead, what they started doing is just like focusing on PR. There's like a lack of transparency. There's a lack of understanding of what people want. And essentially, it's incredibly invalidating. So there are a lot of companies out there that are psychologically so invalidating to the experiences of their employees that the employees are just done with it. Like they're going to act out worse. And so like a good example of this is I heard recently that, someone was replacing strike workers, and then us trolls on the internet, when I say us, I don't know if I'm really included in this, but trolls on the internet decided to spam their job application website with like fake applications, right? Like, I don't think that people realize that like that invalidation of workers' experiences is going to lead to catastrophic problems. And the reason that they have been able to do this for so long is simply because there hasn't been any selection pressure for it, right? So you've been able to invalidate the experience of your employees and tell them to go screw themselves for a long time, which is exactly why it's continued, right? There has been no selection pressure against it. And now there is a selection pressure against it. And so companies are going to have two choices. They can continue to invalidate the experience of their workers and call them lazy and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in which case people are going to quit en masse, and then your company will close, like you'll shut your doors, right? And then you're going to go thinking, oh man, like my company shut down because people are lazy now and they didn't used to be lazy. It's not my fault. It's the world's fault. It has nothing to do with me. There's nothing I could have done differently. It's because workers are lazy now and government government handouts and I'm going to absolve myself of all responsibility by blaming everyone except for myself. It's the government's problem. Kids are lazy. It's video games. It's drugs. It's, have you seen this Justin Bieber? Like all of this stuff. It's no one's fault but my own. Heaven forbid. What are you saying? Are you saying that I should have actually asked my employees, what can I do to get you to stay? What? That's an absurd question. Why on earth would I ever ask that? Are you suggesting that I should ask my employees, like, what would make you happy here? What are you looking for? How can we help you? How can we do a better job as employers? That's absurd. There's no way I can do better. I'm perfect. Like, I thought you guys understood that. Didn't we understand? I'm the boss. I make more money than you. Isn't the amount of money that I make correlated with the amount of perfection that I have? And since I make more money than you do, I'm more perfect than you are, and my opinion matters more than yours. I'm the boss. I'm the boss. I know what's right, and I know what's wrong. I know what's better for you. I know what's good for you, and it's $9 an hour. So I don't know why you're complaining. Right? And then when problems happen, so here's like an example, right? So when problems happen and I get into trouble, because heaven forbid, like, I change anything, that's ridiculous. Like, why would I change anything? Then what happens is, like, when problems start to arise and there are media stories and stuff like that, instead of, I know it's kind of weird, but instead of fixing the problem and saying, hey, maybe I screwed up here, what I do is I hire a PR firm and I'm like, fix my public image. Like, I'm fat and I'm bloated and I'm a corporation. And what I want you to do is tailor me a nice suit so it makes it look good. And then what we're going to do is we're going to rebrand. Right? So we have like rebrand. I have nothing against PR. Like, I think that there's important things, for why perception matters, because sometimes you have the flip side of the coin too, where you are doing a really good job, and because of some kind of slander campaign or some kind of disgruntled people, like, you have to, the battle of perception is important. I'm just saying that the battle of perception should not be a substitute for actually like making improvement, right? And this is like psychology 101 or maybe clinical medicine 101, which is like, if you have a problem in a relationship, you should try to understand the other person's perspective instead of trying to gaslight them through the use of PR into convincing the world that there isn't actually a problem. And somewhere along the way, corporations just started doing that, and it started working really well, which is why they kept doing it, because we didn't hold them accountable for it, right? When we find out that, for example, like, there's human rights stuff in China and Apple and all these kinds of stories come out, and Nike is like using sweatshops and stuff like that. Did we stop purchasing Nike equipment? Did we stop buying Apple products? Did we do any of that stuff? No. Right? And so like if corporations are doing it because they've been able to get away with it, because they haven't been held accountable. And now things are so they're reaching a point due to the access of information and due to, people like realizing that they don't have to commute 2 hours to go to work every day, that the grass is actually greener on the other side. What we're starting to see is like a lot of companies are starting to suffer from that, right? And it's kind of interesting because like there's just a lot of stuff that companies are getting bit in the ass where they were super happy when it happened the first time around. Outsourcing is one example. Another example is like automation, right? So it's kind of interesting because when grocery stores moved from human people checking you out to machines checking you out, they didn't drop prices at all. It's not like anything in the grocery store got cheaper. It's just the company made more money. And now when they're getting automated bots that are clogging their applications, their job application website with fake applications, like they seem to be crying foul when it's like companies have had no problem, automating things when it screws over workers. But heaven forbid, workers start automating things that screw over companies. Like, that's just unfair. The best example of this, I actually had a client who wrote a script to do his job. And then like someone found out about it and they sort of fired him. And then they got like super upset. And he's like, okay, you can fire me if you want to, but you're gonna have to pay a human to do this amount. Instead of rewarding ingenuity and a company actually like automating a worker automating the job, instead of giving that person a gigantic raise and saying, hey, is there anything else that you can automate for us, bro? They just fired him and got super upset. And it's like, it goes both ways, right? So I think what we're starting to see is essentially like a karmic seed coming to fruition. And this anti-worker movement is now starting to really propagate because people are aware that they don't have to put up with this crap anymore. There's actually a selection pressure, that companies have become bloated because there have not been selection pressures against them, right? And now that there are selection pressures against them, they're starting to feel the hurt. And this is getting further propagated by the fact that when you have a problem, instead of actually like addressing the problem and trying to fix it and listening to people's concerns, you call them lazy and blame the government. And as long as like you're doing that, and then you hire a PR firm, those are the three. And if you keep on doing those three things, like, do y'all get that on a very fundamental level? Like, you're not fixing the problem. You can whine about the government as much as you want to, but like until you fix the problem, until you make your place a place where people actually want to work, where they feel hopefully fairly compensated, which there is a flip side to that coin too, because human beings never feel fairly compensated, right? Like you always feel like you could be making more money for doing the work that you do. That's just part of human psychology. It's sort of like this too is a good example. You look at dishes that get done in a house, right? So let's say you live with 4 roommates. Everyone always feels like they're doing the most dishes. That's just how it is. So there are good reasons why, for example, you can't just give in to what workers want, because workers may always feel like they're unjustly compensated, which is human psychology. But at some point, there's some middle ground, right? Where like you don't screw them over and call them lazy and hire a PR firm. You actually listen to what they say. You do your best to fairly compensate them. And then you also recognize that maybe if people are leaving, that you're a shit boss. Maybe if people are leaving, you don't pay them enough. Maybe if people are leaving, like you should reconsider your work environment. And that you try to do what you can to make your employees happy. But until people start doing that, they're going to keep seeing this. Maybe. I don't know. What do y'all think? All right. Like, I'm not saying workers are right about 100% of things, but like, there's just been way too much. Like, there have been too many problems that get propagated and not addressed and not fixed. And it's been going on for too long. So like the workers have been winning only 5% of the time. And so I think they're tired of playing the game, which is why they're quitting. Right. And thankfully, I've worked with companies who, and I've like, it's good. So I like working with companies, and then we'll talk about things like this. Right. So when I go to an investment bank and we'll talk a little bit about, because you got to speak their language. So I'll ask them questions like, how much does your turnover hurt you? What if you could have a place where where your turnover number was 50%? They're like, oh my God, that would be amazing. Right. And then you can even talk the language of dollars and cents. So you can tell them like, how much would that affect your bottom line? And they're like, oh, it would affect our bottom line like this much. How many more deals could you do a year? Oh, we could do like so many more deals a year. Okay. So then like what's the value of those deals? Okay. So like, why not give people more money? Like, they're like, but they haven't earned it. Right. And there's some weird concept of like haven't earned it. It's like, bro, you make $16 million a year. What have you done to earn it? Right. This is something that I realized in medicine. So I was talking to a doctor, and it was talking about, how much money they make. And they were like, well, I've worked my ass off for like the last 16 years. I deserve to make X amount of money. I work 70 hours a week. And it's like, bro, the lady that just was in your office that got diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 45 also works 70 hours a week. She just works worse jobs than you do. She's been working 70 hours a week for longer than you have. Earned it is tricky, right? And this is where, from a corporate perspective, you got to be kind of careful, right? So like if you think about, oh, but what about the justification of that salary? Like there could be a good reason for that. So let's put you in charge for a second, chat. Let's say you run a company with $100 million that makes $100 million in revenue. And you have a choice. You can hire one dude for $5 million a year, or you can hire another dude for $20 million a year. The upside, one guy increases your profits by 5%. The other guy increases your profits by 50%. And since that person is able to increase your profits by 50%, people are willing to pay him $20 million. Which one are you going to hire? Right? It's tricky. There's a flip side of that coin. Right? And so then you're willing to pay $20 million. And it's a justified cost from your perspective. That's how that person is able to command the price that they're able to command. So I'm not saying that, high compensation by definition is like an evil thing. I think there's an economic side to that equation too, which I've come to understand working with like CEOs and entrepreneurs. But this is the kind of thing where, when you work with an investment bank, you got to help them understand that, hey, if you keep I think, because this is my experience, is also what I do for like a lot of our consulting, is that I believe that the happiest, healthiest employees like are the most productive. And so do what you can to make your happy, healthy employees like, do what you can. And the more that you get their back, they'll have yours. And what people have been expecting for far too long is their employees to have their back, and they don't see any benefit from it. You got to be a team player. You got to come in and work Christmas. What do you get for that? Nothing. You get to, since you're the person who's the biggest doormat, you're also going to work Thanksgiving because other people are going to bitch and moan. But since you're actually a team player and you're willing to sacrifice, I'm going to have you work Thanksgiving and July 4th and New Year's, right? And this is the way that you work your hardest employees to extinction, right? It's not unfair. Let's be clear. It's evolutionary. You can call evolution unfair if you want to, but until you start selecting against that kind of thing, it'll continue to happen. So what people have sort of discovered, if you're in the workplace, is that being grumpy and asked to do extra work can be a very good quality, right? It can protect you in some ways, hurt you in other ways. Who's likely to get promoted to manager? The person who comes in on the 4 holidays of the year, or the person who puts on a grumpy face? What do y'all think, chat? Who's more likely to get promoted? Right. So it's interesting. People are saying the grump. Right. So this is where like it depends on the kind of boss that you have. Does the boss select for, if I promote the doormat, then the grump is going to be grumpier about it, and I don't want him to be grumpy about it? Or do I promote the doormat because he's a team player and the grumpy is going to be grumpy? It depends on what you've selected for, right? So as a boss, if you've tolerated grumpy behavior, then you're going to be selecting for that kind of behavior. So it's tricky. It's very tricky. So I think that, just to summarize, I think the Great Resignation has been a long time in coming. I think that there's been a lot of like corporate invalidation of workers' experiences. And so employees are just not willing to put up with that anymore. They've started to realize that they don't have to, because I'm not geographically restricted. I can work from home. And the other thing is that I'm like, the exploitation is just not worth it anymore, right? So the being forced to work all my holidays for some amount of money when the company doesn't have my back in other situations is just not worth it for me. And I think what we're seeing, and just for the record, I think there are a lot of good employers, companies, corporations out there. Like I've heard great things about Costco, for example. Like I haven't seen a single post on the antiwork subreddit about Costco. Right, so it is possible to do a good job. I haven't seen a single post about, the toxic culture at like Supergiant Games, for example. So maybe there is one, maybe there is, I don't know. But, there are some situations where you see people post about toxic work cultures, but there are a lot of companies that are absent from that. So, and then there's another evolutionary thing, which is that instead of actually improving your game design or optics, what you do is just acquire the studios that make good games, and then you drive them into the ground. That's another model which has been evolutionarily supported, because we as gamers don't continue buying the games once they've been acquired and they start making crap. Right? So until there's any kind of selection pressure against it, the behavior will propagate. Right? So if I've worked with a lot of companies that thankfully will realize this, right? So it starts with like bringing value instead of profit. I think the best games are made by people who really, really like want to make a game. And when a company gets behind that, it's awesome. And when a company gets super behind that, sometimes people can also get super upset. Yeah. Okay. So that's my take on the anti-work stuff. All right. No, it's good. I don't. So for the record, I don't think that these people are like evil. I think it's just, it's like, let me put it this way. Let's say you're a degenerate gamer whose mom does your laundry, and makes you tendies every day, right? Until there's some kind of selection on your degeneracy, you're going to continue to be a degenerate. And do we blame you for that? Like, that's just the consequence of the situation, right? And so, like, this is where, like, you guys love shitting on any game development company, but then, like, you know, just be careful, because we all do this, right? I have selection pressures against me that I'm bloated in some ways because there are no selection pressures against me in particular ways, right? Like, we all do this. And so be careful about that. So be careful about judgment. Like, I'm not saying that the world shouldn't be different. You shouldn't try to change it, but just be careful about judging things. Okay. And now chat is thoroughly confused. Okay, so so let me give you all a choice. Do you guys want to talk about maladaptive daydreaming? It's going to be long because it's complicated. Or do you guys want to do like Reddit posts? What do y'all think? Okay. All right, chat, mentally switch gears. No, I don't even think we need a poll. I mean, not trying to upset or discount anyone, but come on, there we go. No lag, chat, no lag, no lag, no lag. Okay. So, I'm going to try to find let me try to find something here. Oh, no, not create post. Search. Okay, sort. Okay. Wow, some of these are long. So let's just do this. So let's look at this. So I want to talk to you all today about something called maladaptive daydreaming, which we've seen a lot of. So someone posted this 5 months ago, addicted to daydreaming. I've never experienced boredom in my life. My addiction to daydreaming is ruining my life. I'm struggling with maladaptive daydreaming. Every waking day I spend 3 or more hours obsessively daydreaming about this perfect me achieving this stupidly impossible goal that will never actually happen. This escapism of mine is out of control. Being addicted to daydreaming. Addicted to self-improvement while not improving. It's a little bit different. Hi, Dr. K. What are your thoughts about maladaptive daydreaming? So this is something that's huge within our community. You guys can kind of see that this is like, you know, there's a post on this every couple of weeks to months. And the truth is that maladaptive daydreaming is something of a new phenomenon. And let me see if I can find a good... like, people are not exactly sure. So maladaptive daydreaming is a newly proposed mental disorder characterized by excessive vivid fantasy activity impairing functioning. We'll get to the rest in a second. So today I'd like to talk to you all about maladaptive daydreaming. So this is going to be a little bit more of an academic talk, okay? So what I mean by that is we're going to go into a lot of different papers. We're going to talk about a lot of neuroscience. We're going to talk about some fundamental principles of psychology and psychiatry and clinical medicine and diagnosis. And then we'll also talk a little bit about, you know, how to weave this together. So what is the neuroscience of maladaptive daydreaming? How does it manifest? Why does it manifest? What are the issues at play? Why is it happening? Why is it happening now more than ever? Why does it happen potentially in our population, in our community, more than potentially other populations in other communities? And then finally, potentially what to do about it. So the first thing that I want to start out is by talking to you all a little bit about the way that a psychiatric diagnosis works, okay? So in psychiatry, when I say that, you know, someone has depression, do you understand what we mean by that? Like, what is depression? Do y'all know? Okay, so someone's saying checks all the boxes, okay? So This is the first thing to understand about psychiatric illness. So people are hypothesizing that maladaptive daydreaming is a new diagnosis. So before we kind of get into it a little bit further, we have to understand what the nature of a psychiatric diagnosis is. So if I say that someone has an anxiety disorder, or has a depressive disorder, or has OCD, the first thing that I want y'all to understand are ADHD. Let's do that. Actually, that's a good one. The first thing that I want y'all to understand is that none of these are like real things. They're not objects or consequences. They're not objects. They're what we call, in medicine, we call them syndromes. So syndromes are collections of observable criteria. And what that means is that, as someone in chat put it, they check the boxes. So in order to have an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, you have to check 2 out of these 3 boxes. And so any given person may check slightly different boxes. So depression it doesn't exist the same in every single person. It's a constellation of symptoms that we kind of lump together. And then we say you have this thing. But it's not like a physical illness. Like, let's say I have heart failure. So in heart failure, for example, there's a discrete problem where the heart is not pumping enough, right? So if I have something called congestive heart failure, that means that my heart has become overly congested and is not able to pump effectively because of this thing called Starling's law. So in physical medicine, we have like discrete, diagnoses that like actually exist, and you can biopsy them, you can x-ray them, you can MRI them, etc. But in mental health, for example, we don't really have those. We have syndromes. And so it's not like I can actually biopsy someone or x-ray someone or do a blood test with someone and discover that they have depression. It's, do they check enough boxes? And sometimes in psychiatry, things get really, really confusing, because you can also have something called an anxious depression. So you can actually have an illness that pulls a couple of boxes from anxiety and pulls a couple of boxes from depression. And so does this person have anxiety plus depression, or do they have an anxious depression? Do they have 2 discrete neurological processes or psychiatric processes going on? Or do they have one process going on in their brain that looks like these 2 sets of constellations, right? So if I have like dots, and, is this something that looks, shit, screwed up. Right? Is this something that looks like an A, or is it a square, or what? Like, what is this? Are these 5 dots a square or an A? Well, sort of both and neither. They're just 5 dots. And so if I'm looking for a square, I can find a square. But if I'm looking for an A, I can find an A too. But the dots is what's real. The A and the square are the constellations or syndromes that we kind of apply on top of them. Are you guys getting this? Does this make sense? So now we're going to get to this concept of maladaptive daydreaming as a new diagnosis. So what maladaptive daydreaming is essentially this like syndrome where people will daydream for hours at a time, to the point where it starts to impair their function. They can't concentrate. They can't focus on schoolwork. They're not able to work. They're not even able sometimes to have fun and play video games or engage in relationships. So they daydream so much and so often that impairs them from doing other things in life. So let's try to understand what's going on in the neuroscience of maladaptive daydreaming. Okay? And so this is where I'm going to start by saying the short answer is we don't know. But there are some really interesting things that some studies have taught us. So let's take a look at some studies, okay? So this is a study that's looking at the comorbidity of daydreaming disorder. So what this means is that if I have someone who has maladaptive daydreaming, what other illnesses are they likely to have? And so when you do structured interviews, so what this means is that 74% of people met criteria for 3 additional disorders. That is insane. 41% of people met criteria for 4. So 76.9% of people met criteria for ADHD. This is nuts, right? So if I take someone, what is that, 76.9%? This means that if I take someone with maladaptive daydream, if I take 100 people with maladaptive daydreaming and I test them for ADHD, 76.9% will have ADHD. Okay, so for anxiety, the number is 71.8%. Okay, and yeah, so we're going to just focus on those two right now. Okay, so what this sort of means is that if you look at maladaptive daydreaming, there is a very high comorbidity with ADHD. And we know that the brains of people with ADHD are somewhat different. And I go into that in a lot of detail if you look at the ADHD and addiction and ADHD and depression video. Okay, so there's a high comorbidity, which tells me that when we're talking about maladaptive and daydreaming, it's not an A or a square. This is a sort of situation where there's a lot of shared points. Does that make sense? And when we look at anxiety, there's a lot of shared points. So this is sort of a situation where if I string these together in this way, I end up with anxiety. If I string them together this way, I end up with maladaptive daydreaming. So I can make all kinds of shapes, or I can make a house. So as we'll see, that there are other things kind of going on as well. So maladaptive daydreaming, dissociation, and dissociative disorders. So when it comes to dissociation and trauma, there's a very tight comorbidity here as well, where people who have a lot of dissociation also tend to have maladaptive daydreaming, and there's also similarities with OCD. Okay, so now this is kind of weird because we have very high comorbidity with this. Let's say, like, I forget what the number is. I think OCD was like 50%, right? And dissociation and trauma, I'm not sure exactly what the number is there, but it tends to be high. So now the question is, like, let's just think about this for a second, okay? Does that mean that people are running around with ADHD and maladaptive daydreaming and maladaptive daydreaming and anxiety? So are these two separate, discrete processes? Is this a brand new diagnosis, which is completely different from the things that we've seen before? And this is where my take is that not really. So I think what we're starting to see, and here's how I'd put it. So let's think about what daydreaming is. So daydreaming is kind of getting lost in fantasy, right? It's not being able to focus. Which in turn means you're kind of losing track of where you are. Okay, does this make sense to people? People are saying sounds like ADHD. And this is where, okay, so if this is how we define daydreaming, what my hypothesis is that ADHD and, let's say, dissociation can both get here, right? So there's some circuits in the brain. So there's like dissociation circuitry and there's attentional circuitry. And both of these circuits, if you have a problem in either of these circuits, you can have this emergent phenomenon of maladaptive daydreaming. Does that make sense? So you could have problems with your attention. So the reason that I get lost in daydreaming is because I have difficulty focusing on particular things. So if my mind is unable to focus, what that means is that I can get distracted and lost into daydreaming very easily. But on the flip side, that's one way to get to daydreaming, but you don't have to get to daydreaming through the unable to focus route. The other way you can get through to daydreaming is through dissociation. So my brain is prone to dissociate and separate from what I'm doing in this particular time. It's not necessarily that I can't focus. It's just that the dissociation circuits of my brain are highly active, so I wind up daydreaming because I dissociate from where I am in time and space. And then maybe there's something with anxiety or OCD, which also is like a third track, which can kind of lead to daydreaming. Okay? So daydreaming, in my kind of limited experience, and especially after looking through the neuroscience and stuff like that, I think is an emergent phenomenon that can come from many different kinds of brains. Okay? And so, like, I think that you can sort of have, this is why we see so much maladaptive daydreaming and sort of why it's been lost as a diagnosis thus far is because people end up getting diagnosed with ADHD. They end up getting diagnosed with this anxiety or trauma or OCD. And so the daydreaming sort of gets lost within these other diagnoses. I don't know that it is a purely its own kind of unique process going on in the brain. I would rather, sort of suggest that it is an emergent phenomenon that is coming out of the neurocircuitry of these other kinds of processes, which are well described. Okay? Now, let's move on to something else. So then the question is, if it is an emergent process that comes from multiple different neuroscientific mechanisms, why does it emerge in all three of these situations, right? So if we look at like how the brain responds, so let's say daydreaming is an outcome of an ADHD brain, daydreaming is an outcome of dissociation circuitry. Why does it always happen? Like, why isn't it that ADHD circuitry ends up with, manifestation A, and dissociation manifests as B, and anxiety manifests as C? Like, instead of if we have three different brains or three different neurological processes, why don't they look different? Why do they all manifest as daydreaming? That's the next question. Okay? Are y'all with me here, by the way? Is this like too much, or are you guys following this? Do y'all need... Okay. So this is very good. Okay. So now someone is saying very good. So they're saying coping mechanism, right? So very good. So now there's a really fascinating paper. Okay. So personality traits and maladaptive daydreaming, fantasy functions and themes in a multi-country sample. So what people did is they analyzed 539 adults who met criteria for maladaptive daydreaming, and then they looked at their personality. And what they discovered is that there are three common things that these people tend to have. So they tend to have grandiosity. They tend to have separation anxiety. And they tend to have anhedonia. Okay? So like, oh, that's interesting. So forget about the comorbidity, forget about the brain. This is now a different kind of research. This is sitting down with a human being and asking them, or analyzing, okay, if you have maladaptive daydreaming, what is your personality like? And what they also found, and this is what's really fascinating, is that each of these different groups of people actually daydreamed about different things, okay? So people who were in the grandiosity camp had daydreams of power, dominance, and wish fulfillment. People with separation anxiety had daydreams of relationships. And this is really important. Of extra attention. And in particular, extra attention given to them by illness or some kind of vulnerability. And what does that mean? That means that when I daydream, I think about, man, it would be so awesome. I literally have a daydream. I don't actually think it's awesome, but I have a daydream about, man, if I got cancer, I would be in bed all day and everyone would be coming to see me and everyone would be bringing me cake and food. And like, I just have this, like, I build this complex fantasy in my mind about this scenario in which I'm ill or vulnerable in some way. And all these different kinds of people are giving me attention. And with anhedonia, this is really interesting. For people who have anhedonia, they have daydreams of escape or physical violence, right? So the people who are anhedonic have daydreams where like something big is happening. I'm feeling something in the daydream. The rest of my life, I don't feel pleasure. I feel numb all the time. But in my daydream, like I'm fighting someone, someone's fighting for me. I'm fighting for my life. I'm wrestling with a shark. I'm wrestling with like some kind of like I get attacked by a jaguar. Like or I'm being hunted by something and I have to run away. So what we start to see when we look at the personality element, right? So this isn't really neuroscience. This is not talking about attention or the brain's capacity to dissociate. When I sit down and talk to people with maladaptive daydreaming, what I tend to find is that there are three categories of sort of personality temperaments, that some people are grandiose, some people have separation anxiety and are afraid of abandonment, and some people are anhedonic. which means that they don't feel pleasure. And that if I ask them what kind of daydreams do you have, they tend to correlate with these 3 buckets, okay? And so what we tried, and this is what's really important about maladaptive daydreaming, is that people will say, oh, I daydream all the time, but it becomes important what you daydream about. And so what people hypothesize is that when I have this kind of brain that tees me up to daydream, and I have some kind of unmet emotional need in my life, I end up with maladaptive daydreaming. So this is sort of like a, it's like an alchemical process where I combine 2 ingredients and I end up with a third. So, for example, if I have ADHD brain, plus I've been abandoned, I'm adopted, or whatever, my dad left, some kind of like thing, equals maladaptive daydreaming. If I have a history of trauma, so I have a dissociation brain, and I'm anhedonic, I can't feel anything, I'm numb, ends up with maladaptive daydreaming. If I have OCD, and I'm a low-wage worker and my boss is mean to me, and I have unmet needs of power and glory, I end up with maladaptive daydreaming. And this is why it's such a tricky diagnosis to find. It's because what we've got is like potentially discrete neurological processes, or maybe it's one neurological process over here, which manifests or looks like any of these 3 things. And then I have an unmet emotional need, and then my brain decides to maladaptive daydream. So this is the way that it fixes the problem. So the reason that maladaptive daydreaming is so hard to get rid of is because it's actually a fix to a problem, right? So I have a brain that's easily distractible, plus I feel abandoned all the time. So what does that result in? It's like I'm going about my day, I'm trying to study, and I have this deep unmet emotional need of like feeling secure about myself. And since my brain is so easily distracted, it always goes back to that deep emotional need. It's like an itch that I have to scratch over and over and over and over again. And my lack of attentional control plus my unmet emotional need, so a neuroscience vulnerability plus an emotional vulnerability, leads to this maladaptive daydreaming. Okay? And so the interesting thing is, so Dr. K, this is a very fascinating theory, and it sounds really cool that you're saying neuroscience, vulnerability, plus unmet emotional need equals maladaptive daydreaming. But is that just like, do you just make it sound good, or is there any like data to support that? And this is the coolest paper that I found. Okay? So, this is super cool, okay? But it's going to be hard, so stay with me, chat. So the first thing is that people looked at, this is something called network theory for understanding maladaptive daydreaming, okay? So network theory sort of is kind of like what I'm saying. It's sort of this emergent property. But what they sort of figured out is they looked at maladaptive daydreaming, and they said that there are 3 factors. There are 3 kind of like buckets of stuff going on with these people. One is what they call kinesthesia and music. So this is where like music triggers their daydreaming, or they use music to maintain their daydreaming. They somehow get lost in the music. Another aspect of maladaptive daydreaming is yearning. So they want to return to the daydream. They're not distressed at all when they're daydreaming. They get annoyed if they get interrupted. They prefer to the daydream. They have a strong urge. It's kind of an enjoyable experience. So they call this thing yearning. This has to do with factor analysis, if you guys know what that is. We're not going to go into too much detail. And then the third thing is impairment. So it interferes with their daily chores. The amount of time that they daydream causes distress. It's difficulty to stay focused. They feel hindered in their life goals. They have difficulty controlling the daydream. It interferes with their work. Sound familiar, by the way, chat? So these are the 3 factors that are associated with maladaptive daydreaming. And then what these researchers did is they looked at emotional regulation. And what they asked themselves is, if I look at emotional regulation, does this correlate with any of these 3 factors? So if someone has, for example, a lack of emotional awareness, are they more likely to experience factor 3, impairment? And what they absolutely discovered is that maladaptive daydreaming can essentially be correlated with emotional regulation factors. And the other really interesting finding that they had is that There's one there's one important inverse correlation, which is the lack of emotional clarity, which is kind of interesting. So what they found is that people who daydream a lot can actually improve emotional clarity over time. So it's almost as if maladaptive daydreamers are using daydreaming as a method of processing their own emotions and understanding what they feel. As they go through all of these like scenarios about feeling loved and being ill and people caring from them, they can actually gain insight into, oh, this is me feeling like lonely. They can actually have some kind of emotional regulation benefit or increased clarity, which is really, really fascinating. So what they essentially found, let me find the key sentence here, is... associations were mostly positive, suggesting that in general, poorer emotional regulation was linked with a higher degree of maladaptive daydreaming symptoms, right? So this is the key thing. So the two nodes in the expanded network with the highest strength centrality were limited emotional regulation strategies and difficulty controlling the daydream, okay? So what this essentially means is that when I have a maladaptive daydreamer who has limited emotional regulation strategies, what are they more likely to do when I take this person? These are the strongest correlations. This leads to maladaptive daydreaming, right? And so this is the kind of situation where essentially we can tie things together now, where we can see, and this paper is a really good example of our hypothesis, that when I have neuroscience vulnerabilities and I have unmet emotional needs, and there's a key thing here, plus no other way to deal with it, this equals maladaptive daydreaming. Do you guys get that? So essentially, what we see is that the more limited you are in your emotional ability to regulate your emotions, the more limited you are in your... right? So let's look at these factors. So the more likely you are to not accept your emotional responses, right? What does that mean? That means I have to escape. The more difficulty you have with goal-directed behaviors, what does that mean? It means I get lost in the daydream. The more impulse control difficulties, and by the way, is this starting to look like ADHD? Oh yeah, that's right. Remember, if you guys remember the neuroscience of ADHD lecture, you remember that impulse control difficulties and emotional dysregulation are a key part of the brain of ADHD. The more lack of emotional awareness that you have, the more limited emotional regulation strategies you have, and the lack of emotional clarity you have, the more likely you are to retreat into the daydream. Right? So we can sort of include those 6 factors right here. And so there's one more thing that I'm going to add, which is really unfortunate. So this is sort of this vicious cycle of maladaptive daydreaming. So when you have maladaptive daydreaming, it leads to poor performance, right? There's no awareness of this stuff or this stuff. So if you talk to people with maladaptive daydreaming, maybe what we can do is like look at a post. So we'll test our hypothesis in a second. We'll pick a random Reddit post from our subreddit, and we'll see if this person has any sense or talks at all in their post about unmet emotional needs or their comorbidities. Because I would suspect maybe this is different because it's our community, and our community tends to be super self-aware. But what we tend to have is maladaptive daydreaming leads to poor performance. This in turn leads to emotional frustration. I don't understand what's wrong with me. Why can't I just focus? Why am I cursed with maladaptive daydreaming? Right? This leads to self-blame. Can you guys see where this is going? And this leads to maladaptive daydreaming. Right? And so as the emotional need increases through maladaptive daydreaming, and by the way, you shouldn't smoke pot because marijuana seems to make this worse. That's the one thing about drugs. Sorry, chat. Right? Because remember, marijuana is also a coping mechanism. I'll pull up that paper if you guys want to see it. And so as the emotional unmet needs increase, and if you don't have abilities to cope with it, if you're not in therapy, you don't have good friends, etc., things like that, meditation. We'll talk about this in a second. Then this is going to increase your maladaptive daydreaming. And then once we increase it, then we go the second round, right? We do it again. We do it again. And then this goes on for a while, and then you're 30 years old. And then it's like, meh, my life is empty. And this is when you start thinking about GGing out, right? I'm not trying to be callous here, but this is what can happen. So maladaptive daydreaming can be a really devastating diagnosis. So just to summarize, maladaptive daydreaming is something that is increasingly common, right? And so let's look at why is that. So this is the last thing. So why are so many people posting about maladaptive daydreaming now? What's going on? Has it been that for 50 years maladaptive daydreaming has sort of existed and people have just ignored it? Or like, is it a new thing? Is there some maladaptive daydreaming virus going around? What's going on? The first is that it seems to correlate with a lot of the vulnerabilities that lead to gaming disorder. So there's some correlation between using gaming as an escape and filling unmet emotional needs. So there's something going on here where like gaming and maladaptive daydreaming essentially serve the same adaptive mechanism, right? Second reason is, can anyone guess it? Heightened levels of maladaptive daydreaming are associated with COVID-19 lockdown, pre-existing psychiatric diagnosis, and intensified psychological dysfunction. You can always blame COVID, chat. You can always blame COVID. So it seems like there are reasons why maladaptive daydreaming is worse. So remember, what is maladaptive daydreaming? It is a unhealthy coping mechanism which the mind relies on due to some way that it's wired. So if I have attentional problems or I dissociate, right? Or I'm obsessive, my mind has an obsessive thinking quality to it, like I'm on the OCD spectrum. So my brain is wired in one of those three ways. And then maladaptive daydreaming emerges as a way to manage your emotional needs given that sort of neuroscience backdrop. And once we add COVID into the mix, it also escalates our emotional needs, and we end up being with more maladaptive daydreaming. Okay? Now, people are probably wondering, what do I do about it? So, I'm going to echo once again that this is not a place where we can give medical advice, but here is how I would approach. Actually, let's stop for a second. Anyone have questions? Before we... How do you fix dissociation? Okay. Summary, please. Okay. So let's start with a summary. Can you repeat all that? Okay. It's a lot. Okay. So I'm going to just talk to y'all, okay? We're going to move away from this. All right. So here's how to understand maladaptive daydreaming in a nutshell. So the first thing is, remember we reviewed the comorbidity data, which suggested that people who maladaptive daydream have a very high likelihood of other psychiatric illnesses. So does that mean that it is a new illness which is completely independent from these other illnesses? No, it actually suggests that there's some kind of common process going on. The second thing that we discovered is that it appears that the type of daydreams that people have correlate with certain unmet emotional needs and personality characteristics. Okay? So, and what that sort of, the third thing that we kind of talked about is that we found a very tight correlation between inability to understand or regulate your own emotions and maladaptive daydreaming. So what does this mean? Why do so many people have maladaptive daydreaming, and why has it been so damn hard to diagnose? Why are people just learning about it now? So my take on it is that there are multiple different brains that can get to maladaptive daydreaming. So one is the ADHD brain, in which case you can't really control your attention. So since you can't control your attention, your mind wanders into the daydream very, very easily. Another kind of brain is the obsessional brain. So 50% of people with maladaptive daydreaming will also have OCD or meet criteria for OCD. So this is a brain that obsesses over some thoughts. This is not attentional wandering. This is actually the opposite, where it holds on to a particular thought extra tight, which happens to be the daydream. The third kind of thing that we tend to see is an association with trauma, okay, or dissociation. And so this is a brain that is able to pull myself out of my current circumstances. So if I'm sitting at a cafe and, someone has left me the bill, my mind will dissociate and I'll go off into la la land and I'll enter the maladaptive daydreaming for like 3 hours and I'll just be sitting at the cafe. So the dissociative brain, the inattentive brain, or the obsessional brain can all result in maladaptive daydreaming. The reason that each of those brains daydreams is because there are unmet emotional needs. There are the grandiose emotional needs. I want to be rich. I want to be powerful. I want to be respected. There are the essentially loneliness needs, separation anxiety. So I don't want to be abandoned, and I'm going to fantasize about being cared for and loved. The third thing is the anhedonic personality, which is my life is numb, my life is empty, I don't feel anything. So the daydreams that I have are about survival, escape, physical violence, things like that. It's not necessarily violence against other people. It's just very emotionally charged, fighting for your life, feeling something kind of dreams. So what we tend to have is when you have one of those people who has one of those unmet emotional needs, and then you stick that emotional need in the brain of someone with ADHD, dissociation, or obsession, plus an inability to process that crap through healthy coping mechanisms or a lack of emotional awareness, you end up with maladaptive daydreaming. And that's kind of like where it comes from, right? So it's sort of a combination of a brain that is predisposed to particular things plus unmet emotional needs. So now people are going to say, okay, what do I do about it, Dr. K? And that's where I'd say that depends, but here's how I'd write it out. Okay, so I don't have a whole lot of clinical experience with maladaptive daydreaming, so take this with a grain of salt. But I do feel pretty confident in what I'm about to say. So if you're talking about what to do about it, first thing you've got to do is figure out what kind of neuroscience vulnerability do you have. Do you have attentional problems, dissociation, or identity problems, or obsessional kind of thoughts? Right? Maybe anxiety is in here too. I'm sort of skipping past that one for reasons. And then what you have to figure out is what's my unmet emotional need? Right? Do you fall into the grandiose camp? Do you fall into the separation anxiety camp? Or do you fall into the anhedonic camp? And then what you have to do is figure out coping strategies and EQ stuff. And so here what you got to do is gain emotional clarity, develop emotional regulation strategies. Okay? Next thing you got to do, drugs. Stop weed. Question, start SSRI. Some evidence of this. Okay? So if we kind of think about tackling maladaptive daydreaming, what I would do is address each of these buckets. And this is just how I practice psychiatry. So what I would do is with the attentional person, I'd teach a particular meditation that trains their attention, which we'll do today. For your unmet emotional need, you could do psychotherapy for something like this, right? So if you have separation anxiety, you could do psychotherapy, right? So here you could even do, meds for ADHD or meditation. And then to gain emotional clarity, you can also do meditation or psychotherapy. But I think actually this is like where some of those like wellness retreats, like out in the woods, go find yourself. This stuff is really great here. Develop emotional regulation strategies. So this is also where meditation works great. But maybe you can do things like ice diving or Wim Hof breathing, etc. Okay? So this is sort of like where you've got to like figure out, okay, which one of these is it? And you have to attack it from all angles. So you have to address this from, okay, what's going on in my brain? Do I have a problem with attention? Then if you increase your mind's ability to focus, then you won't get lost in the daydream as easily. You'll remove the neuroscience vulnerability. If you can meet the unmet emotional need, either through psychotherapy or even like get into a good relationship, right? Get promoted. Go do something fun, like go hiking. Actually, hiking's not right here. Go whitewater rafting. Right? And then gain some emotional clarity, like go find yourself, go meditate, go talk to someone, you know? Develop emotional regulation strategies. So there are a couple of interesting things. So by the way, one of the things that we've sort of figured out recently is that the outcomes from our coaching program seem to be really good, and we've had a lot of data points now. And we were really confused. So the coaching program appears to be about as efficacious, maybe about 70 to 100% as effective as antidepressant medication or anti-anxiety medication, or maybe even as good as psychotherapy. It's not a treatment for those things, so we're not, it's not designed to treat depression or anxiety. But we were just really confused why our coaching intervention appears to be effective for treating illnesses, which it's not. Don't sign up for coaching if you have a mental illness that you're looking for treatment for. You should go see a medical professional. But we were confused why it seems to be helpful. Hopefully that doesn't sound like a contradiction to people. Do people understand the nuance there? And the reason is that we think that our coaching program essentially boosts EQ. So we're actually studying that right now. And that simply by giving people emotional clarity, by giving people emotional regulation strategies, by bringing awareness and self-understanding, that it somehow seems to like negate this stuff over here, which we're not quite sure how that works. We're just as confused as y'all are, right? EQ is emotional quotient. So it's like IQ, but for emotions. The other thing is that there is, if this is ringing true to you, there is a video in Dr. K's guide called The Fantasy Trap, which sort of talks about these unmet emotional needs and sort of like goes into detail about why we get stuck in fantasy and what goes on in the mind when we're having a fantasy. But in short, if we're talking about targeting maladaptive daydreaming, what I would do as a psychiatrist if I were your doctor is to try to approach each of these. Figure out what is the neuroscientific vulnerability, what is the unmet emotional need, and what are the ways in which you process your emotions. And if you can work on all three, I would have a hypothesis that your maladaptive daydreaming would get better. In what order? There isn't an order, right? These are all discrete processes. This is like sort of saying like, if we have a soup, this is an emergent property, remember? This is an emergent property. So it's like if I have, water plus tomatoes plus salt to make a crappy soup, and I end up with soup over here, right? The order isn't important. What's important is that all three end up in there. I mean, I guess technically order is important because culinary stuff is different. So maybe you want to like roast the tomatoes first and then add the salt and later add the water. So that's a bad analogy. And maybe that could be true for this stuff too. Maybe there's a particular order. We just don't have any data on treatment, right? So I don't think it's about order. This is where people like, what order do I do it in? So generally speaking, when I work as a psychiatrist, I don't like, sometimes you have to do order, but when someone comes into my office, I'll give him a prescription, I'll teach him to meditate, and I'll give him a diet plan, like all in day one. Like, do it all, right? They're all independent things. You can do it in whatever order you want, but ideally you'd actually do all three. Okay. So now, just do it all. You're damn right. So here's the thing. So it's possible, if we want to look at it technically, that doing any one of these is sufficient to deal with the daydreaming. It's possible that you don't need to do all three. But this is the kind of thing where if maladaptive daydreaming is ruining your life, I'd fire on all cylinders. Right? So it's possible that if you just get rid of the emotional need, that the maladaptive daydreaming will fall apart. It's very possible. We just don't know that. There's no data to support, what's effective for maladaptive daydreaming. Okay? Okay. Now, other questions? How important is the diet part of treatment? So I think it's really important. So let's understand this real quick. This isn't really about maladaptive daydreaming. But if people are asking how important is diet for treatment? So there's evidence that shows that people who have anxiety have high, let me think about it. No, I think depression. I forget which one. People who have depression have 2 bacteria in the gut that are very, very at a high level. So they have large amounts of a particular kind of 2 bacteria. The other interesting thing is that they have low levels of another kind of bacteria. So there are protective against depression bacteria, and there are bacteria that make you vulnerable to depression. So this we know. This is scientific fact. They've even done stool transplants, which means that you take the gut bacteria of one organism and you stick it in another organism. And we've seen a reversal of depression in mice models. So that sounds bizarre, but it seems like bacteria seem to be a huge part of how depressed you are. And the reason for that is like actually multifactorial. But like, for example, serotonin. So when we give people who are depressed medication, we give them things like SSRIs. So an SSRI is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which means that it boosts the level of serotonin in the brain. So essentially our treatment for depression is to increase your serotonin levels. Where does serotonin in the brain come from in a normal person? The precursors of serotonin are oftentimes produced and metabolized by your gut bacteria. So I suspect that these old systems of medicine like Ayurveda and Chinese medicine essentially figured out how to select for pro-serotonergic bacteria in the gut. And what they did is recommend a particular diet regimen to people who were depressed, and those people got better. And so what I've seen as a psychiatrist is I'll have 2 kinds of patients. 2 people come into my office, depressed. I'll start both of them on an antidepressant medication, and I'll start both of them on an antidepressant diet. 6 months later, both of them are feeling great. And they come to my office and they say, Dr. K, I would like to stop the medication. And I say, great. Let's try weaning you off. And what I tend to find, this is clinical, okay? So this is just anecdotal experience, is that the people who stick with the diet, way easier to come off of medication. The people who don't stick with the diet, they come off of the medication, the depression comes back. So the best answer that I've got is that the people who do the dietary change are producing more endogenous serotonin. I think it makes sense, theoretically. But we don't really have data to really support that conclusion. It's just what I've seen. What's the diet? It's in Dr. K's guide. It's complicated. It's like 6 pages long. So this is why like I can't go over the diet. If I went over the diet, it'd take me like an hour or 2. So this is why we have this all in Dr. K's guide. So the core stuff that we tend to teach, including diets and all that kind of like lists of foods and all that stuff, that's all in Dr. K's guide, which by the way, you can gift now. So y'all can do that. It's complicated, right? So all the multifactorial stuff is in the guide as well. So that's where like the 4 mechanisms through which gut bacteria affect your mental health are all listed out in there. So, yeah. Okay. We've got a little bit of time left. And what I wanted to do one more thing with y'all, which is I wanted to teach you guys some meditation. And this is a little bit weird, but what I wanted to do is teach y'all meditation that sort of targets maladaptive daydreaming. Okay, so, hey.
What do you want for lunch?
Whatever.
On me?
Sure. Okay. Tacos or tendies? Tendies? Okay, hold on. Kruti, I need tendies. Tendies. Chad is saying tendies. Tendies. Tendies for lunch. Tendies.
Like for stream?
No. I don't need them right now. For lunch, I'm gonna eat tendies today.
And just see what happens?
No, I'm just gonna eat tendies. Chad is telling me to eat tendies. Okay, I gotta go. All right, Chad. We've gotten tendies. She's like, wait, do you need them right now? Do you need to eat them on stream? No, we're not gonna eat them on stream. Okay. One more thing to talk to y'all about. Okay, I need tendies, Mom. Okay, last thing. Okay, we're going to teach y'all some meditation. All right, so this is going to be weird, chat. So this is now, okay. How are we going to do this? Okay, so what I want to talk to y'all about now is advanced techniques of meditation, okay? So when I'm developing a meditation regimen for someone, what I try to do is think about the different layers of meditative techniques. And so what do I mean by that? So when we're looking at meditation, right? So what are the different avenues at which meditation can function? So there's the physiologic avenue. There is the neuroscientific avenue. There is potentially the psychological avenue. And then there is the energetic avenue. And then there is the, let me think about what's the best way to put this. We can put this as mental. Let's call it psychological or mental. And then there is the Shakti avenue. Okay, so there's like, this is like prana or chi. Okay, and then there's like the cultivation of the weird, like spiritual stuff. So what does this mean? This means that meditation has been known to affect our physiology. So it can affect, for example, our blood pressure. Right? It can also affect our cortisol levels. We know that meditation affects the brain. There are 3 discrete neuroscientific mechanisms which have been elucidated for different kinds of meditation. So, for example, chanting mantra does different things in your brain than like breathing techniques. So there are at least 3 neuroscientific processes. The psychological or mental is diverse, so there's like millions of different things here. And then there's like what the meditation does to your prana or your chi, and then there's like the weird spiritual stuff. So what I'm going to teach y'all today is a crafted meditation technique that is aimed to deal with maladaptive daydreaming. So if we go back to maladaptive daydreaming, remember there's some neuro stuff. So either the ADHD brain or the dissociative brain or the obsessional brain. And then remember there's an unmet psychological need. So this could be grandiose, abandonment, or what was the third one? Anhedonic. Okay. And then remember that there's an emotional regulation component. So increased clarity of our emotions or the ability to regulate or process emotions. So what I'm going to teach you all today, so when I'm teaching people meditation, so I oftentimes come up with customized meditations for individual patients. And what I try to do is understand like, okay, what are the 3 things that I need to hit? And based on, all the books back there, what can we learn about, the science of meditation? So like, do we know anything about like, cortisol affects the neuro stuff? There may be particular psychological or mental things that need to be met, or there's a certain kind of chi or energy that will cultivate this. There's a particular dharana that will deal with ADHD. There's even identity-related meditations that can target dissociation. Once again, a different kind of dharana that will affect negative thoughts. So in this kind of meditation, we may want to increase flexibility of the mind to target obsessional thinking. And in ADHD, we want to increase the focus of the mind. Does that make sense? So it's actually like the meditation technique that you want to use for obsessional versus ADHD is opposite. One is to increase flexibility of the mind. So here's an example. So for obsessional people, you need to teach detachment or vairagya oriented meditations. For ADHD people, you need to teach focus or dharana. Okay, y'all with me? Like you guys see how that's like different? It's actually not that complicated. And then for a particular samskar, we may need to do Manipura chakra practices to digest that emotional unmet need. And then there's other kinds of stuff like Jnana Yoga or other practices that will increase your emotional clarity. You guys get that? So I'm going to teach you guys essentially a meditative practice that activates your prana, activates the right chakras, hopefully reduces your cortisol level, and reduces anxiety, concentrates the mind, and we're going to focus on Muladhara in Manipura. And if I'm losing you guys, apologies. Give me just one more second. And then we're also going to do some Svara dependent stuff and targets even anhedonia. And also focuses on addressing this. We're going to focus on hinders life's goals, interferes with work. Okay, so we're going to use meditation to target our motivation. Okay, so this is the meditation that we're going to teach you guys today. So this meditation is going to be a little bit different. It's a little bit more complex. It has two parts, which cannot necessarily be done at the same time unless you are very good at meditating or very lucky. Okay, do you guys get this? Does that make sense? Any questions about the meditation? Now, this is, okay, focus. No. What's wrong with this auto-focusing stuff? Focus, there we go. Okay. So I know it's kind of weird, but this is one of those things where, like, if you guys don't have any clue what I'm talking about, I apologize, but there are a lot of people in our community who have been here for a while and do know what I'm talking about. So we can't keep on doing the basic crap over and over and over again because they get bored. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, a lot of this stuff is explained, guess where? In Dr. K's guide, right? So that's why we have it. It's not like I'm not trying to sell it more aggressively today. It's just genuinely the reason we made that is so that you guys can watch it at your own convenience, and then, like, we can just, you know, we're doing advanced stuff on stream, so you guys have to go back to the basics, okay? So here's what we're going to do. There are two practices. Practice number one is left nostril breathing, picturing red and repeating to yourself, ah, with every inhalation or with every breath, okay? So I know it's kind of weird. We're going to take our thumb, block our right nostril. And what we're going to do is I'm going to close my eyes. So I'm going to block my right nostril. I'm going to close my eyes, and I'm going to picture a red screen. And as I breathe in and out, I'm going to breathe in and out 16 times. I'm going to hear the word, the syllable, ah, 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 okay, with each breath. So close your eyes. Picture like a red screen in front of your mind. Use your thumb to block your right nostril. And then as you breathe in, hear or ah. Okay. So I should have told you all we're starting. Sorry, so I calmed down a little bit. So just a couple of things. So remember 3 components of the practice. Component number 1, breathe in through the left nostril. Component number 2, with your eyes closed, see red. And component number 3, hear the letter A, or ah, within your breath with each inhalation and each exhalation. Do this practice 16 times. Bonus points if your left nostril is more open than your right nostril. Okay? Now, some of you may say, oh, isn't that kind of weird where you're asking me to do like 3 different things all at the same time? You're damn right I am. Because for people with maladaptive daydreaming, remember that you need to adjust what your mind is focused on, right? So it may need flexibility, it may need focus. This is also a good technique for people with ADHD because you're going to have to do 3 different things. So you can bounce between those 3 different things. Also has the added ability of, it's got some weird mystical stuff in there where it is going to increase your rajas and improve things like anhedonia and motivation. That's part 1 of the practice. Part 2 of the practice is very similar, except we're going to breathe through our right nostril. We're going to use the mantra Ram, and we are going to envision a yellow screen. So this is where we're going to take our pinky, block the left nostril, and then we're going to breathe 16 times, envisioning yellow and repeating the mantra Ram. I'll demonstrate 3 breaths. Okay. Wow, someone has a... It's great. The Pepe. Okay. So, left nostril, red, ah. Right nostril, yellow, ram. 16 breaths each time. Now, you don't have to do both of the sets together. You can do each one when the said nostril is open. So when your left nostril is open, do the left practice. When your right nostril is open, do the right practice. Okay? This is definitely a more advanced technique. You know, it's not going to hurt you or anything, but it's aimed at activating different dimensions of how meditation works. So my hope is that it'll boost your motivation. It'll help you digest some of those emotions and unmet needs, while also doing some things like kind of calming down your physiology and addressing your attentional problems within the brain. How many times a week? You should do it every day. So do each half of the practice at least once every day. What happens if you can feel like you can breathe well with just one nostril? That is completely normal. Unless you have a deviated septum, it's going to alternate throughout the day. So find a moment when your left nostril is open and do your 16 breaths. Find a moment when your right nostril is open and do your 16 breaths. Okay, so one person is saying, when I want to see yellow, I see red. Good, keep practicing. It's okay if yellow was easier than red, right? There is a way to switch nostrils. That requires a yoga danda. But we are not going to teach the yoga danda. It is advanced practice. We are not going to do it. Why red and yellow? Because we are going to activate the Muladhara and Manipura chakras respectively. Okay? How many sets? Just 1 set is fine. You can do more if you want to. Like if you want to do like half an hour of meditative practice, you can, but let's start small, right? So 16 breaths with the appropriate nostril, appropriate color, and appropriate mantra. Can a colorblind person do it too? Yeah, it's funny because anytime I teach a meditation, right, everyone's just asking about like, what about this? What about this? What about this? Then I'm not sure. So my point with sort of showing you guys the theory, showing you all the theory of the meditation, is that it's tailored, right? So it's tailored to a particular person with their particular neuroscience, with their particular cognitive needs. It's tailored to that. And so if you're colorblind, I would start by asking you, like, what can you see when you close your eyes? How much of meditation is sort of fooling yourself? I would say very little. I think the people who fool themselves are oftentimes the ones who think they're meditating, and that's what's super sad. Like the ultra spiritual people are the ones that are truly fooling themselves. If you actually meditate, you're not fooling yourself at all, because fooling requires the mind, and the purpose of the meditation is to go beyond mind, at which point you can't be fooled because there's no mental activity. Is there a meditative disorder, too much meditation? Absolutely. There are all kinds of meditative disorders. There are different kinds of OCD and psychosis delusions that involve meditation, and there's also meditation-induced psychosis. So people who meditate very, very severely and like go overboard can become mentally ill. It's hard to see colors. Keep practicing. Isn't imagining red and yellow mental process? Potentially. Seeing red and yellow is not. Can you become addicted to meditation? Unlikely. Very unlikely. Can meditation also begin to cause daydreaming in itself? No. So meditation won't begin to cause daydreaming. Your maladaptive daydreaming may activate while you are meditating. That could absolutely happen, but that's also why the practice is structured the way that it is. What are the most powerful techniques that you know, or is it just depending on the person which is most powerful advanced? No, there are powerful techniques of meditation. And I have not and probably will never disclose the most powerful techniques that I know. I would say, in short, tantric meditation is incredibly powerful. Can you teach us Yoga Danda? Not today. Maybe one day. Seriously. I mean, I'm not saying that to be like... So this is the tricky thing, right? So I know when I say that, everyone's going to start memeing. But the truth is, like, this needs to be talked about. Like, we can't just not talk about the things just because people get excited about them. Like, the whole point about meditation is that it's been overly sterilized and it's, like, lost, like, 90% of its potency. Right? If you guys want to learn the secrets to levitate and other forbidden jutsus, you have to start by doing this crap. When y'all are ready, a teacher will present themselves. So, someone's saying, is seeing red or yellow mental, or can you actually see it? Start with the first and end with the latter. Okay? All right, who are we rating, chat? So kriyas can be incredibly powerful. It depends on the kriya. By the way, kriyas are organized in the way that I showed y'all today. So I was even debating about calling it, this is the way that kriyas are developed. So kriya is like a form of meditation that's usually like a compound meditation that's developed by a very advanced spiritual person. And it's also like meditation, trademarked meditation tends to be different kinds of kriyas. Okay. Who are we rating? What did y'all decide? Okay. Krika is not there. You want to raid Miskiff? Okay, we can raid Miskiff. Is Miskiff live? Okay, we'll raid Miskiff. Okay, we'll see y'all taking Hades. Big person or small person? Taken Hades. Okay, we'll read Taken Hades. Okay. No, people are saying misgift though. I'm confused, dude. Okay, do you guys want to do anime reacts or whatever the F misgift is doing? Okay, we'll raid Taken Hades. That's fine. All right, we'll see y'all on Wednesday. Okay, so I know today's stream was a little bit different. I know it was a little bit more in depth. You know, we're still on the struggle bus here in terms of figuring out how much basic stuff do we do, how much advanced stuff do we do. Y'all keep us posted on whether y'all want the more advanced stuff or not, or you guys want to stick to the basics. I think it's a little bit tricky because sometimes things that are a little bit more accessible can increase our viewership, but we're really here about delivering value as opposed to being big. So keep us posted about, you know, do we want to teach 10% of the information to 100 people, or do we want to teach 10 people like 50% of the information? It's tricky. So we try to balance it, and if you guys feel like we're going too far on one side or the other, just let us know, and we'll do our best to adjust. Love y'all. Take care. We'll see y'all on Wednesday.